The first rule of being dead is to stay quiet. I've been legally dead since a boating accident in Puget Sound claimed the life of Dr. Elias Thorne in the fall of 2019. The second rule is to never get comfortable. That's why I chose Montana. The sheer unforgiving emptiness of it feels like an ally. My cabin is nestled so deep in the Bitterroot Mountains that even the satellite imagery blurs into a meaningless smear of green and brown. It's a fortress of solitude, walled in by pine, rock, and 10,000 square miles of government-owned wilderness. My closest neighbor is a retired smoke jumper 6 miles down a dirt road that washes out 3 months of the year. He thinks I'm a novelist with a trust fund. It's a clean lie, simple. Tonight the wind is a physical presence, a restless beast clawing at the log walls. It's the kind of night that makes you feel the thinness of civilization. I sit in my worn leather armchair, a glass of whiskey sweating on the table beside me, the glow of my security monitors painting my face in a cold blue light. 16 cameras, a perimeter fence with pressure sensors, and a satellite uplink that costs more than most people's mortgages. Paranoia is an expensive habit, but it's the one I can't afford to kick. The scars on my forearms, a roadmap of raised silver tissue, are a constant reminder of why. They ache when the temperature drops, a phantom pain from a ghost's touch. I trace one of them with my finger, the one that curves around my wrist like a bracelet. The memory is always there, lurking just beneath the surface. The shriek of twisting metal, the flash of black eyes, the impossible warmth of its hand before the gunfire started. Then I hear it. It starts low, a mournful note carried on the wind, almost lost in the rustle of the pines. At first, I dismiss it. A wolf. A coyote. This is their world, after all. But I've spent years listening to recordings of gray wolves, studying their vocalizations, their pack dynamics. I know their language of howls and yips. This is not that. This sound has a different timbre, a deeper resonance that vibrates in my chest. It holds a note of something that isn't purely animal, a hollow, aching quality, like a lament. It's the sound I used to hear on audio feeds from Sub-Level K, the sound that haunted my dreams for more than a decade. My hand tightens around the whiskey glass. The ice cubes clink, a small, sharp sound in the sudden silence of the room. I set the glass down, my movements slow and deliberate, and lean closer to the monitors. I toggle the audio sensors, amplifying the exterior microphones. The wind howls again, and this time the other sound rises to meet it, clearer and closer. It's a long, drawn-out cry that seems to tear itself from a throat that wasn't built for it. It's a sound of agony trying to become a word. My heart hammers against my ribs. It can't be. Not here. Not after all this time. I force myself to breathe, the air catching in my throat. I tell myself it's the isolation, the whiskey, the ghosts of a life I buried. But my body knows better. The cold sweat on my neck isn't from memory. It's from instinct. I rewind the footage on camera 7, the one pointed at the northern edge of the clearing. The timestamp glows in the corner. 23:47:12. I watch the trees sway in the wind, their branches like skeletal fingers against the bruised purple of the night sky. Nothing. I fast forward, my eyes scanning the screen, searching for any flicker of movement. Then I stop, right at the edge of the infrared floodlight's reach, where the light surrenders to shadow. For a single frame, there's a flicker, a distortion. I play it back, frame by frame. There. A shape detaches itself from the darkness of the trees. It's tall, far taller than a man, and hunched as if weighed down by its own unnatural anatomy. It moves with a fluid, predatory grace that is terrifyingly fast. It's not an animal running on all fours. It's on 2 legs. For a fraction of a second, before it vanishes back into the impenetrable black of the forest. The shape turns its head. I can't see a face, no features, but I can feel its attention, a palpable weight across the distance. A predator's gaze. The whiskey in my stomach turns to acid. They found me. Or worse, it found me. The shadow on the screen wasn't just a shape, it was a key. unlocking a door in my mind I had bolted shut years ago. The sight of it, that specific stooped posture, the bipedal movement that was too fluid to be human, threw me backward in time, not to the chaos of the end, but to the cold, sterile dread of the beginning. To my first day at Fort Lewis. The official designation was the Canine Analysis Wing, a deliberately mundane name for a place that was anything but. To those of us who worked there, it was simply Sub-Level K. The name itself felt like a warning. K, the 10th letter, a dead end. The facility wasn't on any public map of the base. To get there, you had to pass through 3 separate armed checkpoints, each one delving deeper into the earth, until the air itself changed. The clean, pine-scented air of Washington state gave way to something manufactured. It was a cocktail of ozone from the air scrubbers, the sharp scent of industrial disinfectant, and a faint, underlying metallic tang that I could taste on the back of my tongue. It was the smell of a cage. Director Marcus Sterling met me at the final airlock. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from ice. Tall, unnaturally still, with pale blue eyes that didn't so much look at you as assess you, cataloging weaknesses. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, a stark contrast to the sterile white lab coats of everyone else. He was a creature of the political world, a handler, not a scientist. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "Welcome to the Vanguard." He didn't offer a hand. He led me through a series of corridors that were less like hallways and more like surgical incisions. The walls were seamless, made of a polished white polymer that reflected the harsh, shadowless light from the ceiling panels. There were no windows, no clocks, no connection to the world above. The only sound was the constant low hum of the ventilation system and the soft chime that announced our approach to each pressure-sealed door. The silence between the chimes was absolute, a crushing weight that made you aware of your own heartbeat. Something felt profoundly wrong. This wasn't a research lab. It was a tomb. "Your work on zoonotic transmission at Fort Detrick was impressive," Sterling said, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. "But that was theoretical. Here, we deal with the practical application." I didn't know what to say. The transfer had been abrupt, my orders classified above my security clearance. All I knew was that the Argus program needed my expertise in genetic sequencing. I thought I was here to help stop the next pandemic, not to whatever this was. We stopped before a thick, transparent wall that stretched from floor to ceiling. It wasn't glass. It felt colder, denser. Sterling placed his hand on a biometric scanner, and a section of the wall slid aside with a near-silent hiss. We stepped onto an observation deck overlooking a circular chamber below. "Officially, we analyze unique biological samples for national security purposes," Sterling continued, his gaze fixed on the room below. "In practice, Doctor, we are cartographers. We are mapping the very edges of what is possible." The chamber below was dominated by a series of massive cylinders arranged in a circle. They were made of the same transparent material as the wall, each one at least 30 feet high. Most were empty, but one was not. Sterling led me to the railing. "Our primary asset," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone that might have been reverence or fear. "Prototype designation, Lupus 9. I followed his gaze. In the far corner of the cylinder, huddled in the sterile white light, was a figure. It was humanoid in shape, but profoundly, fundamentally wrong. It was tall, even hunched over, with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and covered in a sparse, downy fuzz, like the fur of a newborn animal. Its back was curved, the vertebrae of its spine prominent beneath the skin. It was still, its face turned away from us. For a moment, I thought it might be a statue, a macabre piece of art. Then it moved. It shifted its weight, a slow, deliberate motion, and turned its head towards the observation deck. The face was a grotesque parody of a human's. The jaw was elongated, distended, filled with teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. The nose was flat, the nostrils wide slits. But the eyes were what broke me. They were large, perfectly round, and completely black. No iris, no pupil, no sclera. Just two pools of polished obsidian that drank the light and reflected nothing. They fixed on me, and in that instant, I felt a connection that was both intimate and terrifying. It was the gaze of a being that recognized me not just as an observer, but as a fellow creature, as prey. It knew I was there. It was watching me. And in the black, bottomless depth of its eyes, I saw an intelligence that was ancient, hungry, and utterly devoid of anything I could call human. Seeing that thing in the cylinder, Lupus 9, was like being struck by lightning. It rewired my entire understanding of the world in a single, silent, horrifying instant. Every assumption I had made about my work, my transfer, my purpose, burned away, leaving only the chilling certainty that I had stepped into a nightmare. My mind raced backward, frantically trying to connect the dots to find the path that had led me to this moment, standing on a precipice overlooking a monster of our own making. The path had started 2 years earlier, at Fort Detrick. I was a rising star in USAMRIID's genomics division, one of the best viral sequencers they had. My job was to map the genetic drift of potential bioweapons, to anticipate mutations, to stay one step ahead of nature and our enemies. It was important work, defensive work, or so I thought. Then the Argus program reached out. It wasn't an invitation, it was a reassignment. My CO told me it was a multi-agency task force on emerging zoonotic threats. The name itself, Argus, should have been a clue. In Greek mythology, Argus Panoptes was a giant with 100 eyes, a perfect watchman, but he was also a monster. Before I was sent to the Fort Lewis facility, I spent 6 months in a sterile, windowless office in Virginia, analyzing the samples they sent me. They were geological cores, they said, extracted by survey teams from deep, unexplored cave systems in the Appalachian Mountains. The samples contained fragmented DNA. My job was to sequence them. The official project name for this material was Linea L-alpha. The first few samples were unremarkable. Bat guano, fungal spores, trace DNA from bears and other cave-dwelling animals. Standard stuff. But then came sample 07A. The moment I ran it through the sequencer, the system flagged dozens of anomalies. The base structure was primate, undeniably so. Most of it aligned with Homo sapiens, over 95%, but the remaining percentage was a chaotic, beautiful mess. It was like nothing I had ever seen. There were gene sequences that looked like they had been lifted from Canis lupus, the gray wolf, but they weren't direct copies. They were integrated, hybridized, woven into the very fabric of the primate DNA. I focused on the anomalies. There were markers for hyperactivated keratin production, far beyond what would be needed for hair and nails. It was structured for something more like claws or a dermal armor. I found genes linked to bone density that were amplified to an impossible degree. The models suggested a skeletal structure that could withstand crushing impacts, and most disturbing of all, I found unique alleles associated with cellular regeneration, far more efficient than any known human or primate equivalent. This thing wasn't just strong, it was designed to heal fast. I brought my findings to Director Sterling during one of his weekly check-ins. I laid out the data printouts on the polished table of a sterile conference room. "Director," I said, my voice filled with the thrill of scientific discovery, "this isn't just a new species of primate. The hybridization it's almost synthetic. The way these lupine genes are integrated, it defies natural evolution. And this section here," I pointed to the regeneration markers, "this could revolutionize medicine." Sterling didn't even glance at the papers. He kept his pale eyes fixed on my face, his expression unreadable. He let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before he spoke. "It's contamination, Doctor," he said, his voice flat and final. "The samples are thousands of years old. They've been exposed to countless animal remains. What you're seeing is genetic noise from a wolf carcass that decayed in proximity to the hominid remains." "No," I insisted, shaking my head. The integration is too clean. The mitochondrial DNA is consistent across the entire strand. This isn't two separate samples mixed together. This is one organism. Sterling leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room. He didn't raise his voice, but the intensity in his gaze was suffocating. Your job is to sequence what we provide, Dr. Thorne. Not to editorialize. Log it as contaminated primate DNA and move on to the next sample. I opened my mouth to argue, but something in his eyes stopped me. It was a flicker of something, not anger, not frustration. It was the look of a man carefully placing a lid on a box full of snakes. As he said the word contamination, I saw his jaw clench, just for a fraction of a second. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible muscle twitch, but in the sterile silence of that room, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the physical manifestation of a lie. He knew. He knew exactly what it was. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't being paid to find answers. I was being paid to handle forbidden knowledge, to catalog the pieces of a puzzle I was never meant to solve. Life in sub-level K settled into a grim routine. Days were measured not by the sun, which we never saw, but by the cycling of the harsh LED lights from a simulated day to a dimmer night. My work became a compartmentalized process of denial. I would spend 10 hours in my lab, sequencing the genetic material of Lupus 9, blood, tissue, saliva, and trying to understand the volatile miracle of its biology. I focused on the science, on the elegant and terrifying way the genes express themselves. I told myself I was just a researcher, but every time I walked past that glass cylinder, and those black eyes followed my every move, the lie would crumble. The incident, as they called it, happened on a Tuesday. I wasn't on the observation deck when it happened. I was in my lab, staring at a screen that showed Lupus 9's telomeres were not shortening. Biologically, it wasn't aging. The alarms blared suddenly, a jarring, whooping cry that shattered the tomb-like silence of the facility. A voice, cold and robotic, echoed from the intercoms. Containment breach in Section Gamma. All non-essential personnel report to lockdown stations. This is not a drill. Section Gamma was the specimen's housing unit. My blood ran cold. We were locked in our labs for 3 hours. When the all-clear was finally given, the air in the corridor was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else. Something coppery and hot. There were hushed, frantic whispers. Someone had been hurt. Badly. The next morning, Report 14B was on my desk terminal. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. It stated that during a routine nutritional delivery, Subject L9 exhibited unpredictable behavior, resulting in a minor breach of containment protocols. It went on to say that a technician, a man named Peters, had sustained a significant laceration to his left forearm and was in stable condition at the base hospital. The report was signed by Director Sterling. It was a clean, neat, and utter fabrication. Later that day, I was in the mess hall, pushing tasteless food around my plate, when I overheard 2 security guards talking at the next table. They spoke in low, hushed tones, thinking no one could hear them over the hum of the ventilation. "Did you see it?" one of them asked, his voice shaky. "I was on the response team. The cylinder is supposed to be 4 inches thick. He punched through it. Just punched." "What about Peters?" the other one asked. The first guard let out a shaky breath. "There was no arm, man. It wasn't a laceration. The thing, it tore his arm clean off at the elbow, just pulled it right through the hole he'd made in the glass. I've never seen so much blood. He was screaming." He trailed off, the memory clearly too much. They had to put 3 dozen rounds into the thing before it even slowed down. And the sounds it was making. I felt sick. I got up and left, my food untouched. I walked back towards my lab, my mind reeling. The report was a lie designed to maintain order, to keep the project's grunts like me from panicking. Peters wasn't in a hospital. His family would be told he died in a training accident. He would be erased. The project, I realized, consumed everything. Not just ethics, not just science, but people. My path took me down the main corridor past Section Gamma. The area was cordoned off with biohazard tape. A team in full hazmat suits was working inside the containment chamber. They had replaced the shattered panel on the cylinder, and it was now empty. Lupus 9 was gone. But my attention was drawn to what the cleanup crew was doing. They weren't just mopping. One of the figures was holding a high-pressure sprayer, the kind used for industrial cleaning. He was spraying a clear, viscous fluid onto the polished floor just outside the cylinder, where the guards had said Peters had been standing. The moment the fluid hit the floor, it started to hiss and steam, a fine, acrid smoke rising from the surface. The white polymer began to bubble and dissolve, turning black at the edges. They weren't cleaning the blood. They were erasing the floor itself, melting away the top layer of the facility to ensure that not a single cell, not one microscopic trace of what had happened, would ever be found. They were sterilizing the truth out of existence. The lies of sub-level K were one thing. They were contained, buried half a mile underground. But in the spring of 2015, the project's dirty secret clawed its way to the surface. I was pulled from my lab work by Sterling himself. My new assignment, field supervisor. "We have a situation in Kentucky," he told me, his face a blank mask. "A geological survey team, subcontracted by the Department of the Interior, reported a cave-in. There's one survivor. She's agitated." Agitated was an understatement. I met the geologist, a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne, in a medical tent at a makeshift government camp deep in the Appalachian wilderness. She was sedated, but her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have physically changed her. She kept whispering about the collapse, about being trapped in the dark. "It wasn't just the rocks," she mumbled, grabbing my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "We weren't alone down there. After the collapse in the dark, there were things moving. They were tall, covered in hair. They smelled like old blood." She started to sob. "They screamed. It wasn't an animal sound. It sounded like people. They were screaming in the dark." My blood turned to ice. It was a classic Argus cleanup operation. The official story was a tragic geological accident. Our job was to go in, retrieve the bodies and equipment, and make sure any anomalous evidence disappeared. We were the ghosts who erased the footprints of monsters. I led a small, specialized team into the cave system. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else. That same faint, musky, coppery scent from the containment chamber of Lupus 9. My stomach clenched. This wasn't a story from a traumatized geologist. This was real. Deep inside, past the site of the collapse, we found their survey camp. It was torn apart. Equipment was smashed, food supplies ripped open with what looked like brute force. And then we found the blood. It was splattered on the wall of the cavern, a dark arterial spray. It was still fresh, wet. My tech ran a field test with a portable sequencing unit. He looked at me, his face pale in the beam of his headlamp. "Sir," he whispered, showing me the screen. "It's a match. Linea L alpha, 99.8% identical to the base genome of L9. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't one of the original specimens from the cave. This was one of ours. The DNA was from the hybridized, weaponized version created in sub-level K. One of them had escaped, or been released. We were no longer just studying a phenomenon. We were chasing our own sins through the dark bowels of the earth. We worked through the day, collecting samples, documenting the scene for the sanitized report we would have to write. By the time we emerged, night had fallen. The air had grown colder, and the dense forest surrounding the cave entrance felt oppressive, watchful. A heavy fog was rolling in, muffling all sound. I stood by my tent trying to process the implications. An active, hostile specimen was loose in the civilian world. This was the ultimate nightmare scenario. As I stood there, a cold breeze blew out from the mouth of the cave, a foul exhalation from the mountain itself. It carried that smell, stronger now, of iron and wet fur and decay. It was a predator's scent. My gaze fell to the muddy ground at my feet. And then I saw it. Just at the edge of the light cast by the camp's generator, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a footprint. It was shaped like a human foot, heel, arch, 5 toes, but it was enormous, at least 20 inches long. The toes were tipped with deep gouges in the mud where claws had dug in for purchase. My eyes followed the trail. There was another and another, leading from the darkness of the forest, circling our camp, before disappearing back into the trees. It had been watching us. It was still out there, somewhere in the fog, listening, waiting. The discovery of the footprint changed everything. The mission was no longer about recovery. It was about survival. The camp, which had felt like a secure outpost of civilization, now felt like a fragile, illuminated cage surrounded by an ocean of darkness. The military contingent with us, a silent, grim-faced unit in unmarked fatigues, doubled the perimeter guard. No one slept that night. My place was in the command tent, a canvas bubble filled with the glow of monitors and the low hum of electronics. We had deployed a series of advanced thermal cameras around the perimeter, pointing both into the forest and at the mouth of the cave. For hours, the screens showed nothing but the ghostly white heat signatures of trees swaying in the wind and the occasional scurrying of a raccoon or an opossum. The tension was a physical thing, a tightening in my chest that made it hard to breathe. Around 3 a.m. it happened. "Contact," a tech next to me whispered, his voice tight. "Camera 4, edge of the tree line." My head snapped to the monitor. A new shape had appeared, a brilliant white against the cool blue of the background. It was large, the size of a grizzly bear, and it was moving with a low, deliberate crawl, using the underbrush for cover. It was on all fours. My heart pounded. It was using a quadrupedal gait, just as the models had predicted it could, maximizing stealth and speed. "Look," I said, pointing to the screen. "It's movement. It's not an animal. It's tactical. It's testing our perimeter." As if it had heard me, the shape stopped. It slowly raised its upper body, unfolding to its full, terrifying height. It stood on 2 legs, a towering, slender silhouette of heat. A man-shaped ghost. It turned its head, scanning the camp, its posture radiating an unnerving intelligence. It knew about the lights, the fence, the guards. It was studying us. Then, a sound drifted through the night, captured by the sensitive microphones. It was a low, guttural chuffing, a series of clicks and deep, throaty rumbles. I had the tech isolate and amplify the audio. Listening to it, my skin crawled. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was more complex than that. It was communication. It sounded like it was trying to form words with a vocal apparatus that had been horribly re-engineered. A broken language for a broken thing. The figure on the screen held its position for a full minute, a silent, white-hot specter in the dark. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it dropped back to all fours and melted back into the woods, vanishing from the thermal scope as if it had never been there. The silence it left behind was more terrifying than the noise it had made. 2 days later, Director Sterling's voice came over the encrypted satellite phone. His orders were cold and absolute. "The situation is untenable. The asset cannot be recovered. The site is to be sterilized. Your team is to pull back to the designated extraction point in 1 hour. A geological ordnance team is en route." I knew what geological ordnance meant. They were going to bring the mountain down. They weren't just sealing the cave. They were going to bury the creature and the bodies of the geologists under 100,000 tons of rock and soil, erasing the entire event from the face of the earth. We evacuated as ordered. From a ridge 2 miles away, we watched as the team planted the charges. The forest fell silent as if holding its breath. The countdown was piped into our comms. 3, 2, 1. The explosion was not a loud bang, but a deep, rolling tremor that vibrated up through the soles of my boots. The side of the mountain bulged outward, then collapsed in on itself in a deafening avalanche of stone and dirt. A massive cloud of dust billowed into the night sky, momentarily blotting out the stars. The cave, the camp, the evidence, all of it was gone, buried. But just before the roar of the collapsing mountain consumed all other sound, I heard it. Carried on the shock wave, faint but clear, was one last sound from the direction of the cave. It wasn't the guttural clicks or the broken speech I'd heard on the audio feed. It was a single, high-pitched, piercing cry. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and despair. And it was unmistakably, horribly a human scream. The Kentucky incident sent a shockwave through the Argus program. The unspoken truth was now undeniable. We had lost control. The specimens were more intelligent, more adaptable, and more resilient than the initial projections had ever suggested. In response, security protocols at sub-level K were tightened to an impossible degree. The remaining prototypes, there were 3 of them now in separate reinforced cylinders, were kept under constant sedation. The atmosphere in the facility, already tense, became suffocating with paranoia. We weren't just researchers anymore. We were prison guards on the brink of a riot. The breach happened 6 months later. It wasn't a clever escape or a calculated attack. It was simple, mundane failure. A winter storm had knocked out a primary power substation on the surface. The base's backup generators kicked in, but there was a momentary power dip, a flicker lasting no more than 3 seconds. For 3 seconds, the electromagnetic locks on the containment cylinders disengaged, and the automated sedative dispensers went offline. 3 seconds was all it took. The alarms shrieked to life, the same horrifying whoop from before, but this time it felt different. It was accompanied by a sound that shook the very foundations of the facility, the percussive, rhythmic booming of something immense hitting the transparent walls of the cylinders. Then came the sound of cracking like a giant sheet of ice breaking apart, followed by a final, explosive shatter. I was in the corridor heading towards the central lab. Chaos erupted. Security personnel were shouting into their radios, their faces grim. Red lights flashed, painting the white walls in blood-red strobes. I could hear gunfire, the sharp crack of assault rifles, followed by a wet, tearing sound, and a human scream that was cut off abruptly. Before I could retreat to a lockdown point, one of the pressure doors ahead of me buckled inward, torn from its hinges as if it were made of aluminum foil. Standing in the mangled frame was Lupus 11, the largest of the specimens. It was magnificent and terrifying. In the flashing red light, its pale skin and downy fur were soaked in blood, not its own. It stood to its full height, nearly 9 feet tall, its long limbs ending in claws that dripped crimson. Its black eyes scanned the corridor and they fixed on me. There was no thought, only pure animal instinct. I ran. I scrambled into a nearby observation room, slamming the heavy steel door shut and hitting the manual lock. I could hear it coming down the hall, its heavy footfalls accompanied by the sickening click of its claws on the polymer floor. It didn't roar. It made a low, guttural breathing sound, a hungry pant. A fist made of biological concrete slammed into the door. The steel groaned, the frame bending. Another impact, and the lock mechanism shattered. The door flew open. I was trapped, backed into a corner. The creature filled the doorway, its massive frame blocking out the light. It took a step inside, then another, its black eyes locked on mine. This was it. This was how I died. My life didn't flash before my eyes. All I could see was that face, that nightmare hybrid of man and wolf. It stopped just 5 feet away. I could smell the blood on it, could feel the heat radiating from its body. I had my arms raised instinctively to shield my face, exposing the old pale scars from a childhood accident on my forearm. The creature's gaze dropped from my face to my arm. Its head tilted, a flicker of something other than rage in its eyes. Confusion? Recognition? It took a slow step forward. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the tearing claws, the crushing jaw. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, tentative touch on my arm. I opened my eyes. It had reached out its hand, a massive, claw-tipped appendage still slick with blood. and was gently tracing the largest of my scars with the tip of one claw. The touch was impossibly delicate. Its skin, where it wasn't covered in blood, was hot, almost feverish, but undeniably alive. It felt human. It leaned its face close to mine. Its breath was hot and smelled of meat and ozone. I could see my own terrified reflection in the bottomless black of its eyes. It looked at me, a deep, searching gaze, and for a moment the monster was gone, replaced by a prisoner looking out through the bars of its own flesh. Then it whispered. It was one sound, a single, guttural, rasping word from deep in its chest. A sound I had never heard before and would never understand. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a question, a plea. The moment was shattered by the thunderous arrival of the security team. They opened fire without hesitation. The room erupted in a storm of noise and light. The creature barely flinched as the first rounds hit its torso, but it turned away from me, shielding me with its own body. It looked back at me one last time, its black eyes wide with something that looked like sorrow, before it lunged towards the guards. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was its body absorbing dozens of rounds before it finally, silently, fell. I woke up in the infirmary. The official story was that I'd been knocked unconscious by the concussion of the door breaking. There was no mention of the creature, of its touch, of its final whispered word. When I asked, I was met with blank stares and evasive answers. The incident was being classified at the highest level. Within 48 hours, every trace of the breach had been scrubbed, every piece of evidence locked away or incinerated. The two other prototypes were terminated via lethal gas injection into their cylinders. Sub-level K fell silent. A week later, we were all summoned to a mandatory briefing. Director Sterling stood at a lectern in the main conference room, the same cold, imposing figure as always. But something was different. There was a finality in his posture. As a result of recent events, he began, his voice devoid of emotion. A full-scale review of the Argus program has been conducted at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. The conclusion is that the program, in its current form, has reached the limits of its operational viability. The risks have begun to outweigh the potential strategic gains. A murmur went through the assembled staff. We all knew what was coming. Effective immediately, Sterling continued, the Argus program is being terminated. All research will cease. All biological assets have been neutralized. This facility will be decommissioned over the next 30 days. He let that sink in. It wasn't relief I felt. It was a cold, creeping dread. This wasn't an ending. It was a burial. They were burying the evidence, and they were burying us with it, not in graves, but in silence. The next few weeks were a blur of shredding documents, wiping servers, and signing papers. The final document was a non-disclosure agreement, unlike any I had ever seen. It was bound by national security laws so obscure and powerful that violating it wasn't just a felony. It was an act of treason. The penalties were life in a military prison, or worse. We were signing our lives away, agreeing to erase the last 7 years from our memories. We were to become ghosts. My final meeting was with Sterling, alone in his now empty office. The walls were bare, the desk cleared. He slid a thick file across the polished surface towards me. It was my severance package. A generous pension, a new identity if I wanted one, relocation assistance. It was hush money on a governmental scale. You did good work here, Thorne, he said. It was the first time he had ever offered anything resembling praise. It felt like a threat. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. To all of this? It never existed, Sterling said simply. As of next month, the K9 analysis wing will be a footnote in a budget report for a munitions depot. The geological surveys in the Appalachians will be sealed due to seismic instability. The men who died here died in training accidents. The world will forget this place ever existed, and so will you. I looked at the scars on my arm, a permanent reminder of the truth. I could still feel the creature's touch, still hear its whispered word in my dreams. Forgetting wasn't an option. I stood up to leave, the file feeling heavy as lead in my hands. As I reached the door, Sterling spoke one last time, his voice low and chilling. "A piece of advice, Doctor," he said. I turned to look at him. He was standing by the windowless wall, a shadow in a sterile white room. "Don't ever fool yourself into thinking you're free. When a project of this magnitude is terminated, it's not because it's a failure. It's because they've learned everything they need from the prototype phase." He took a step closer, his pale eyes pinning me in place. "They don't destroy projects like this. They just move them to a bigger cage." Sterling's final words echoed in my mind for months. A bigger cage. He wasn't just talking about a new facility. He was talking about the world. I knew then that my life was over. Not in a physical sense, not yet. But the identity of Dr. Elias Thorne, the brilliant geneticist, was a liability. He knew too much. He had seen the truth. He had been touched by the monster. And in the cold calculus of the people who ran the Argus program, a liability is just a problem waiting for a solution. I couldn't just disappear. They would find me. The kind of people who can build monsters in a secret lab under a mountain can certainly find one man. No, I had to die. It had to be convincing, public, and final. I spent the next year meticulously planning my own death. I used my severance money, the blood money, to fund my escape. I moved to Seattle, taking a low-level consulting job with a biotech firm. It was a deliberately boring, predictable life. I built routines. I went to the same coffee shop every morning. I frequented the same 3 restaurants. I established a pattern, a life that could be easily tracked and verified. All the while, I was building another life in the shadows. Using the dark web and skills I never thought I'd need, I created a new identity from scratch. A birth certificate from a hospital that burned down in the 80s. A social security number from a child who died in infancy. A driver's license from a corrupt DMV clerk in another state. Piece by piece, a man named Ben Carter was born. He was a freelance writer who had inherited enough money to live modestly without a traditional job. He was a ghost, a nobody. Perfect. The final piece was the accident. I bought an old but reliable boat. I became an avid fisherman, spending every weekend out on Puget Sound. I filed float plans. I made sure people saw me leaving the marina. I was building a narrative for the authorities to find later. The day I chose was overcast, with a storm predicted for the late afternoon. Perfect conditions. I sailed the boat out to a remote, deep-water channel. I had already prepared a second package. A waterproof bag with cash, my new identification, a burner phone, and a bus ticket to a small town 2 states away. As the sky darkened and the first drops of rain began to fall, I sent a final garbled text to a colleague. Engine trouble, storm moving in fast. Then I threw the phone into the water. I rigged a small, remote detonated explosive to the fuel line, just enough to cause a fire, not an obliteration. I didn't want them to find too much of the boat, but I didn't want them to find a body either. Doubt was my ally. I slipped into the cold, gray water wearing a dry suit beneath my clothes, my go bag strapped to my chest. I swam for over a mile to a secluded cove where I had stashed a small inflatable raft. By the time the explosion echoed across the water, I was already paddling towards a stretch of coastline far from any prying eyes. I watched the orange glow of the fire against the dark clouds for a moment. Dr. Elias Thorne was burning on that pyre. It took me 3 weeks of hopping buses and living out of cheap motels to make my way to Montana. I paid cash for the cabin and the land around it. I built my fortress. I settled into the quiet life of Ben Carter. But I never forgot. I never stopped looking over my shoulder. Every unfamiliar car on the dirt road, every unexpected knock at the door sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The paranoia became a part of me, as essential as breathing. I knew they could have found me if they had really looked. The fact that they hadn't was, in some ways, more terrifying. Did they think I was dead? Or did they just not care? Was I so insignificant that I wasn't even worth hunting? Now, standing in my cabin, the blue light of the security monitor illuminating my face, I know the answer. They weren't hunting me because they didn't have to. They just had to wait. They had created a better hunter. A sharp metallic snap echoes from the darkness outside, loud enough to be heard over the wind. It's the sound of thick gauge wire breaking under immense strain. I look down at my security tablet. The icon for the southern perimeter fence sensor, half a mile out, flashes a single stark word in red: breached. The flashing red light on the tablet seemed to pulse in time with my own racing heart. Breached. The word was an electric shock, jolting me out of my stunned paralysis and into a state of cold, practiced readiness. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment I had dreaded for 3 years. The ghosts had come out of the past and were now walking on my land. I moved with a silent economic grace that would have surprised the man I pretended to be. First, the main breaker. I plunged the cabin into absolute darkness, killing every light, every humming appliance. The only illumination was the faint moonlight filtering through the windows and the dying red glow of the tablet in my hand. Darkness was my friend. I knew the layout of this house better than my own skin. They did not. Next, the weapon. From a hidden compartment in the wall behind the fireplace, I pulled out a short-barreled semi-automatic shotgun. It was loaded with heavy-duty slugs, designed for stopping a charging bear. I hoped it would be enough. I slung a bandolier of extra shells over my shoulder. The weight was comforting, a solid, tangible reality in a world that was rapidly dissolving into a nightmare. My bare feet made no sound on the cold wooden floor as I moved towards the main living area. My eyes, already adjusted to the low light, scanned the windows. The forest outside was a wall of impenetrable black, the trees shifting like wraiths in the wind. The howling had stopped. The silence that replaced it was infinitely worse. It was a listening silence, a hunting silence. I crouched behind the large sofa, my back against the wall, the shotgun held at the ready. My senses were on fire. Every creak of the house settling, every gust of wind against the eaves was amplified into a potential threat. My mind raced, trying to calculate, to strategize. How many? Just the one I saw on the camera? Or were there more? Were they intelligent enough to flank the cabin, to test for weaknesses? Then I smelled it. It was faint at first, a subtle, unnatural scent cutting through the familiar smell of pine and damp earth. It was an artificial smell, a chemical smell that had been seared into my memory. It was the scent of ozone from the high-powered air purifiers mixed with the sharp, pickling odor of formaldehyde-based sterilizing agents. It was the unique, signature scent of Sub-Level K. The smell of the creatures. It was impossible. That scent shouldn't be here, in the clean air of the Montana wilderness. It was as if they had brought the very air of their prison with them. The scent was getting stronger, meaning it was getting closer. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I risked a peek over the top of the sofa, my eyes scanning the windows on the far side of the room. Nothing, just black glass reflecting the faint outlines of the furniture. I held my breath, listening. I heard a faint scratching sound like claws on wood coming from the front porch. It was testing the door. I shifted my position, moving silently towards the kitchen, which offered a better vantage point of both the front and back of the cabin. I pressed myself into the shadows of a deep doorway, the cold of the wall seeping through my shirt. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, heavy and expectant. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Had it gone? Was it playing a game with me? I decided to risk a look. Slowly, carefully, I leaned out from the doorway, my gaze fixed on the large picture window that looked out over the darkened valley. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a weak, silvery light across the clearing. My breath hitched in my throat. Standing just at the edge of the porch, partially obscured by a support beam, was a silhouette. It was massive, hunched, its long arms hanging nearly to its knees. It was perfectly still, its head cocked as if listening. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking slightly. I centered the sight on its chest. My finger tightened on the trigger. Just as I was about to fire, it moved. It didn't charge. It didn't roar. It took one silent step to the side, out from behind the beam, and into the full moonlight. And then, with a horrifying, deliberate slowness, it raised its head and looked directly at the window. Directly at me. Our eyes locked through the glass. There was no mistaking that obsidian blackness, that empty, light-devouring gaze. It knew I was there. It had known the whole time. It had been waiting for me to see it. And in that instant of frozen terror, a blur of motion came from my left, with an explosive crack that sounded like a rifle shot. A huge dark hand with claws like obsidian knives smashed through the kitchen window, not 3 inches from my face. Glass sprayed across the room. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the full, overpowering stench of ozone and damp fur. I stumbled back, my heart seizing in my chest, as the thing outside the window let out a low, hungry growl. The world exploded into a vortex of instinct and action. I didn't think. I reacted. As the clawed hand retracted from the shattered window, I fired the shotgun. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap of violence that lit up the room in a flash of orange. The heavy slug tore through the window frame, and I was answered by a shriek of pain from the darkness outside, a sound that was a horrifying mix of animal rage and human agony. I didn't wait to see the result. I knew the creature on the porch would be coming for the front door. I scrambled backward, ejecting the spent shell and chambering a new one. The front door, solid oak reinforced with a steel core, shuddered as something immense slammed into it. The wood splintered, and the deadbolt groaned in protest. They were hurting me. The one at the window had been a feint, a distraction to draw my attention while the other one attacked from the front. My mind, sharpened by years of paranoia, saw the pattern immediately. This wasn't a frenzied, mindless assault. It was a coordinated, intelligent hunt. I retreated from the main living area, moving deeper into the cabin's corridor. Another slam against the front door, and this time the frame cracked. It wouldn't hold for more than one more hit. My escape route was the basement, my final sanctuary. The door was at the end of the hall. I ran, my bare feet slapping against the floorboards. Behind me, the front door burst inward with a scream of tortured wood and metal. A colossal shape filled the doorway, momentarily silhouetted against the pale moonlight. I didn't look back. I wrenched open the basement door, plunged down the steep wooden steps, and slammed the heavy steel-lined door shut behind me. I threw the 3 thick industrial-grade deadbolts into place just as the creature hit the other side. The entire doorframe shook, but it held. My safe room. It was my final line of defense. The small, windowless basement was encased in reinforced concrete. The door was custom-built, a 3-inch thick slab of steel. I was safe. For now. I stood in the pitch black, my chest heaving, listening to the sounds from above. I could hear them moving through my house, the heavy, clawed footfalls, the sound of furniture being overturned, of my carefully constructed life being torn apart. They were searching for me. The rage and frustration were palpable in the sounds of destruction. After a few minutes, the rampage upstairs subsided. A heavy silence fell over the house. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump coming down the basement stairs. My blood ran cold. One of them was on the other side of my door. I backed away, raising the shotgun again, aiming it at the center of the steel door. My hands were slick with sweat. I could hear its breathing now, a low, wet, rasping sound right on the other side of the door. It was so close I felt I could feel the vibrations through the steel. Then came a new sound. Scrap. Screech. The sound of its claws dragging slowly down the face of the door, a deliberate, nerve-shredding act of intimidation. It was telling me it was there. It was telling me I was trapped. The sound was designed to inspire terror, and it was working. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, and then a voice. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a low, guttural whisper, a sound that seemed to struggle its way through a throat not designed for human speech. The sound vibrated through the steel door, and I felt it in the bones of my chest. It was the same sound the other one had made years ago in Sublevel K just before it died. But this time it was different. It was clearer, more defined. It was trying to shape a word, syllable by agonizing syllable. Lee, as. My name. It whispered my name. The shotgun slipped from my sweaty grasp and clattered to the concrete floor. My legs gave out, and I slid down the wall into a sitting position, my mind completely shattered. They weren't just hunting me. They knew who I was. The creature on the other side of the door, the monster from the lab, the ghost of my past. It knew my name. The sound of my name, spoken by that broken voice, changed the equation of my terror. The fear of a mindless beast was replaced by the far more profound horror of a thinking, knowing enemy. How? How could it know my name? Was it the one from the lab, the one that had touched my scars? Had it survived? Or had the information been passed on? My mind, a scientist's mind, even in the depths of fear, recoiled from the impossibility. Genetic memory, a collective consciousness. The implications were staggering. I crawled towards the door, my fear now mixed with a desperate, terrifying curiosity. The door had a small, reinforced peephole, a one-way lens I had installed for just this purpose. My hand trembled as I slid the metal cover aside. My eye pressed against the cold glass, and I looked into the face of my nightmare. The creature was crouched on the stairs, its face just inches from the door. The low light from the broken front door cast it in a relief of shadow and pale moonlight. I could see the coarse, downy fur, the elongated jaw, the flat, slitted nostrils. But it was the eyes that held me. They were not the black, empty voids I remembered. In this proximity, I could see that they weren't truly black. They were an incredibly dark, deep brown, and within them I saw something that stopped my heart. It was not the mindless hunger of a predator. It was a desperate, lucid, and unmistakable intelligence. And it was terrified. It saw the shutter of the peephole move. Its eyes locked onto mine. It leaned closer, its breath fogging the small lens. And it spoke again, its voice a low, gravelly whisper that was clearer now, more practiced. They are coming. 3 words. 3 simple words that reconfigured my entire reality. I stumbled back from the door, my mind reeling. The destruction upstairs, the coordinated attack, the chase. It wasn't a hunt. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to get to me, to warn me. Who? I whispered, my voice hoarse, knowing it couldn't possibly hear me. Who is coming? As if in answer, the creature at the door looked up over its shoulder towards the sound of the wind outside my broken house. It let out a low, mournful keen, the same sound I had heard earlier, the sound I had mistaken for a threat. It wasn't a howl of aggression. It was a sound of fear. And suddenly I understood. I understood everything. Sterling's final words came back to me. They don't destroy projects like this, they just move them to a bigger cage. These creatures at my door, they were the prototypes, the L9, the L11, the ones we had studied, tortured, and failed to control. They were the failures that had escaped or been set loose. They were intelligent, yes, but they were still primal, driven by the violent, hybridized instincts we had forced upon them. But the project never stopped. It evolved. They learned from their mistakes. They perfected the process. They refined the gene splicing, stabilized the aggression, enhanced the intelligence, and enforced absolute control. They had successes now. A new generation, smarter, stronger, faster, and perfectly, terrifyingly obedient. The real soldiers, the true monsters. The creatures tearing my house apart weren't hunting me. They were fleeing. They had come to me, the only human who had ever shown one of them a moment of something other than clinical cruelty, because they were being hunted by their own kind. The apex predators we had created were now being pursued by the ones that came after. The experiment hadn't just gotten out of the cage. The new, improved models were now the cage keepers. and their job was to clean up the program's old, loose ends. That included the escaped prototypes, and it included me. My cabin wasn't a fortress. It was a tomb I had built for myself. I looked around the concrete room, at the shotgun on the floor. It was useless. Whatever was coming wouldn't be stopped by a shotgun. Whatever was coming was the culmination of 15 years of unethical science and unlimited black budget funding. I never imagined that the most heinous secret of my country was not buried in classified documents, but in living flesh, pulsating, breathing, hungry. I worked for the CIA for almost 15 years, in the biotechnology division of the Argus program, a name that never existed on official paper. Officially, we were a cell for analyzing zoonotic pathogens. In practice, we were an invisible arm of genetic experiments conducted in labs that not even the Pentagon itself had free access to. I came on in 2008, transferred from Fort Detrick, thinking I was going to work on sequencing viral genomes for biodefense. But I soon realized the focus wasn't the virus. It was the host, and the host in that case was human. Now, as I hear a new sound in the distance, the low rhythmic chop of helicopter blades cutting through the Montana night, I know my time is up. The true Argus is coming, the 100-eyed monster. And it's for this reason that I decided to tell this story, broadcasting it on an encrypted dead man switch signal from the hard drive in this basement. There are no eternal secrets. The government can burn reports, but it cannot erase the blood mixed in the soil of the mountains. They were not studying wolves. They were studying us. And now that they know it works, you must understand what that means. The experiment is not over. It has just been released from its cage. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story gave you chills, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and drop a comment below. I'd love to know from which city or country are you watching this. See you in the next narrative.